want you to question the comfort that you get from compromise. When we're faced with divergent possibilities, we often seek the middle ground. And this is a useful mental shortcut which often does good for us, but it can go wrong, and sometimes we don't notice when it goes wrong. I see this in my clinical work as a psychiatrist. 10-year-old Brandon's parents are divorced. They can't decide with which parent he would be better off living, and so he lives 1 week with his lonely father in Parramatta, the other week with his mother's new family in Manly. He goes to school halfway in between, which means that he has no school friends within 20 miles of where he lives. He's constantly tired from travel and from the emotional demands of his divided loyalty towards his parents. I think a good example of bad compromise on a more global stage is Israel-Palestine. I think that a real possibility of Middle Eastern peace is contingent on the establishment of a single democratic secular state within the boundaries of Israel-Palestine, the so-called one-state solution that would restore human rights to Palestinians. Now, the divergent view to that is a different kind of one-state solution. It's a radical Zionist proposal that, based on ancient religious precedent, the state should be freed of any non-Jewish residents, or at least their human rights should be further eroded. Now, many of you will be passionate in opposing both of those positions. You'll say that both of them represent a failure to compromise. Well, I visited the result of decades of compromise last year, and what I saw was settlements, checkpoints, the security wall, reducing Indigenous Palestinians to various levels of sub-citizenship. One of the radical unifying approaches needs to be adopted. We can't compromise our way to the right number of settlements or the right course for the security wall. Once you go looking for bad compromises, they're pretty easy to find. We laugh at committees and how they tend to gravitate towards the least confronting and often ridiculous lowest common denominator compromise. Who needs committees? A recent example of a toxic situation where the choice was neither one thing nor the other was a decision to suspend the processing of asylum seekers who have arrived by boat, most of them for a 6-month period. Now, compromise is usually presented to us as a generous act, as a form of political maturity. I want to argue that, in fact, compromise is more often about political expediency and is often an intellectually and morally lazy stance for people to take. Compromise is more often about pleasing people than it is about grappling with really difficult decisions. Now, sometimes that need not necessarily be a bad thing. There are times in which people's happiness is more important than the truth. But I want you to think about a time in the last week when you've compromised, either at work or at home with your children perhaps. And I want you to examine whether that compromise was in the best interest or whether, in fact, it was something that you knew you should have taken a stand on but elected not to. I think we need to find a space for hard-edged negotiation where we, faced with two difficult options, we decide that we are going to choose one of those options and we live with the consequences. Now, that's not the same thing as being pig-headed. If new evidence emerges, we should change our mind. That's not compromising. That's reacting to evidence. We should also be careful about accepting established wisdom, things that already seem to be decided. If it looks like the middle ground is a strong consensus, think, in fact, This might be a black and white issue. There might be a right or wrong answer. And of course, vice versa. But uncertainty doesn't necessarily signal that there are shades of grey. If you toss a coin, you don't know whether it will come down heads or tails, but it will be one or the other. A close cousin to compromise is risk-avoidant decision-making. This is where, faced with a difficult choice, we take the option that makes us least uncomfortable in the short term. Angry, awkward Grace, who was 15, took an overdose, a serious overdose, and finished up in hospital. And she was still suicidal. Now, the safest immediate thing for us to have done would have been to keep her in hospital. But it seemed that the biggest issue for Grace was that she could no longer bear her parents fighting. And if we put her into hospital, or kept her in hospital, we would have been identifying her as the sick one. We would also have been saying that the family couldn't really manage the problem that was facing them. So we elected to take what was in the short term the riskier option, which was to discharge her, in the expectation that we might be able to help the family to exploit the crisis in order to be able to make changes in the marriage. The big area where you and I have to make a decision about whether there's a right or wrong answer is in relation to whether climate change is something that needs our urgent attention or whether we can wait and see. Now, here's an area where we might be inclined to hedge our bets. How many of us are paying money towards tree planting to offset carbon use, but at the same time turning a blind eye to the high polluting profile of our superannuation portfolio? Hedging our bets is really the same as not betting at all. So how should we make a decision in this area? The idea would be if we could each, for ourselves, take the evidence apart and arrive at our own conclusion. Most of us don't have the resources to be able to do that. And so it comes down, to a certain extent, to deciding which expert we're going to trust. And here are some shortcuts which might help you to make that decision. Sadly, we're all self-seeking and biased. I, for example, as a doctor, am very scared about the health impact of climate change. I need to declare that interest. We also need to look at interests that extend beyond the individual. We need to look at an expert's affiliation with industry. And probably, if an expert's career stands to be enhanced by, say, the petrochemical industry, or their point of view is amplified directly or indirectly by the petrochemical industry, then we should discount their opinion accordingly. Whether or not they're wittingly biased, we know from a raft of research that people's opinions will be influenced by those kind of obligations. You can't find the truth by checking what most people think, although our politicians seem to think you can. Nor is the truth a blend of available opinion. And truth isn't necessarily what matches your own ideology. And haggling might be a good way of deciding what the right price is of something that you want to buy, but you can't haggle your way to the truth. It's intolerance of doubt that drives us towards the middle ground. I'd urge you to resist the pleasant numbing that comes from compromise, and to take the chance of being wrong and to make decisions out of not knowing rather than some false sense of certainty. If you toss a coin and you bet on it coming up heads, you'll be right only half the time. If you bet that it's going to land on its edge, you'll be wrong always. Thank you.